they had a good deal. They seem to think they can get a better deal, and they're doing this, but they might end up with another war.
The second night of US strikes on Iran, the Americans say around 90 were hit, and also, just like last night, Iran has attacked targets in Bahrain and Kuwait. President Trump said at the NATO summit yesterday that the ceasefire was over. He called the country's leadership scum and cuckoo after US ships were attacked in the Strait of Hormuz. Well, Samer Al-Atrush is the Times Middle East correspondent and joins us live now. Good morning.
Good morning.
It sounds like these were fairly significant attacks. Were they greater in number than the ones that went before?
Well, it's roughly the same number of declared attacks and seemingly the same type of targets that they did the first round. Now, that doesn't seem to have had much effect. Again, as you mentioned, Iran has struck Kuwait and Bahrain, but also reports of striking a U.S. airbase in Qatar for the first time. So what we're seeing is, I think, a widening escalation. And the next step that Iran might take, and they had threatened to do this yesterday, was to close the Strait of Hormuz again. They're claiming that the U.S. has violated the MOU, which is a similar accusation that the U.S. has leveled against Iran. And they want to bring back that leverage. I think when they had closed the strait, Trump said he would be prepared for that. He said that oil prices would rise again and, quote, I'm fine with that. Now, that may not be true in his case, but we are seeing it's still a contained escalation, I think. It's not a resumption of the war, but these things do take a life of their own.
And where are we in terms of the further talks to try and find peace? Because we've had the Memorandum of Understanding, but talks have been paused since then, and obviously we're now in a very different situation. Is there any prospect of getting back to those talks now?
I think the talks are going to be ongoing. What seems, I mean, the biggest escalation so far, I mean, aside from the missiles going and the explosions going off, I think it's two things. It's the U.S. has rescinded their waiver for Iran to sell oil. So they've resumed the sanctions, and Iran is threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz. Now, that would bring us back to the situation we were in during the war. But at the same time, there are some fundamentals in that neither side really has an interest in a full resumption of the war. I mean, Trump has been making the case for weeks against his detractors that even if the U.S. were to continue bombing Iran, it's not going to result in a drastic change. I think he closed the door on that. And the Iranians do have an interest in having the sanctions removed and getting the much needed finances into the country. But what we're seeing, I think, is that Iranians, as they bury Ayatollah Khamenei this week, I think they're very hesitant about going back to the way he conducted things, which was very careful, very prudent, and which, in their view, I believe, gave their enemies the idea that they were weaker than they were. What they're trying to do is be more assertive and just make sure that any sort of perceived violation of the ceasefire is answered by force. Now, the risk for them is that they are, kind of cutting off the branch that they're sitting on, and that they're overextending. They had a good deal. They seem to think they can get a better deal, and they're doing this, but they might end up with another war.
Yeah, that's a fascinating but also not very comforting point. Samer, thank you very much. That's Samer Al-Atrush, the Middle East correspondent for The Times.
Well, there's been a second night of US strikes on Iran. The Americans say around 90 targets were hit. And also, just like last night, Iran has attacked targets in Bahrain and Kuwait. The attacks follow President Trump calling the Iranian regime scum at the NATO summit. How should we assess the seriousness of the resumption of the conflict? Well, the price of oil has risen over the past 2 days. Brent crude is now at $78 a barrel, some way off the peak of $113 back in May. So is the situation bad, but not that bad? Ali Vaez is an Iran specialist at the International Crisis Group. Ali, morning to you.
Good morning.
Can we say that the war is back on? Is it as straightforward as that, do you think?
No, I don't think so. I think the ceasefire is definitely in a dire strait, but it is not yet at a point that we can say it has fully collapsed. And the reason is that I think both sides understand that the alternative is not really that much more attractive for them. They have experienced an all-out conflict, and they know that at high risk and at very high cost, they will probably end up more or less where they are right now after another round of serious conflict. So I believe these tit-for-tats are basically negotiations by other means.
Does this boil down to the fact that Trump's got himself into a war where he didn't realise how the primacy of the Strait of Hormuz or the leverage that Iran would be able to make use of it with? And that's the key point in all of this, that the Strait of Hormuz can be controlled by Iran, and that causes conflict, but it also ultimately means Trump has to get to the table at some point.
Well, that was one of the faulty assumptions going into this conflict, that President Trump didn't fully appreciate, that geography basically grants Iran a superpower, and the fact that it had not used it didn't mean that it won't. And now that Iran has obtained that a very powerful point of leverage, it's not going to give it away easily. It's not even going to allow it to erode in the way that we saw with attacks on vessels in the past few weeks, because the U.S. was trying to open an alternative transit route much closer to the Omani territorial waters. But at the end of the day, again, a set of faulty assumptions doesn't mean that the U.S. is easily going to give up, or that the Iranians are easily going to give up. And, at the end of the day, the better way of trying to enforce the interpretation of this agreement is not through force, but through dialogue. They did this last week when they were in Doha, and there were some issues over unfreezing of Iranian frozen assets. I think that's the better way of addressing disagreements over the strait as well.
Does scum, calling the regime scum, make any difference to this? I mean, Trump just says what he thinks, and there's plenty of people in America and around the Western world who would use that phrase to describe the hardline Iranian regime, but it is a regime he's supposed to be talking to, and he has previously called them good guys. Does that language make any difference, do you think?
Yeah, well, as you said, he changes his tune sometimes several times in a day. Really being fixated on the choice of words is not the best approach in dealing with President Trump. But nevertheless, he does make it more difficult for the Iranian leadership to deal with him because he's inconsistent, because when he insults them, the political cost of engaging with the same president who withdrew from an agreement with Iran, twice bombed Iran in the middle of negotiations, killed its top military commander in 2020, killed its supreme leader in 2026. The cost is already high, and President Trump just doesn't help it with his own rhetoric. Just
finally, I mean, this is heading to a fudge, isn't it? Maybe even just a constant ongoing series of negotiations that more or less maintains the status quo or makes it slightly better. This is how this feels like it's going, doesn't it?
Yes, I do believe that it would be in a state of suspended animation, that every now and then you will hear from the parties that they've made some progress diplomatically, and then you would see the emergence of tensions, but in a very limited, low-level conflict. But it's very hard to imagine that we would either go back to all-out war or reach a final agreement that would resolve these issues in a substantive manner.